Dennis Bowman, the Allegan County man who confessed to murdering his adopted daughter back in 1989, finally sentenced in her killing this morning.
The 14-year-old girl was adopted just 9 months old. Her biological mother was in court for that sentencing today.
In March of 1989, on a rural property in western Michigan, a 14-year-old girl disappeared. There was no public abduction, no confirmed witness who saw her get into a car, no dramatic scene left behind for police to reconstruct. What remained was a story, that she had stolen money and run away. But even before that story entered the file, the girl at the center of it, Aundria Michelle Bowman, had already tried to tell adults that something was wrong. According to later reporting, she had expressed fear about going home and accused her adoptive father of molesting her. Then, not long after, she was gone. For decades, the case sat in one of the most dangerous categories a missing child can enter: runaway. That label can sound ordinary. It can make a disappearance feel temporary. It can lower urgency before the facts are even tested. And in Aundria's case, it placed distance between investigators and the possibility that the threat had never been outside the home at all. The mystery was not only where she had gone, it was whether the first explanation anyone heard had been the wrong one from the very beginning. More than 30 years later, a different cold case, in a different state, would force this one back into the light. A decades-old murder investigation in Virginia would lead police back to Michigan, back to the Bowman property, and back to the question that should have defined the case in 1989. What happened to Aundria Bowman after she said she was afraid? But before we dive deep into this story, please let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this interest you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Before she was known publicly as Aundria Bowman, she was born Alexis Miranda Badger on June 23, 1974, in New Orleans. She was placed for adoption as an infant and was adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman of Michigan. On paper, it was the beginning of an ordinary family story, a child adopted into a home, raised far from where she was born, growing up in a quiet part of the Midwest. But in cases like this, paperwork can establish identity without ever explaining what life inside a household actually looked like. That setting matters. Hamilton and the surrounding parts of Allegan County offered privacy, distance, and the kind of rural landscape where homes could sit apart from each other. Routines could go unnoticed, and a disappearance from private property could leave very little for outsiders to see. In a case that would eventually turn on what happened inside one family, that isolation becomes more than backdrop. It becomes part of the story. By late 1988, adults at Aundria's high school had reportedly begun noticing something that did not fit the ordinary pattern of teenage moodiness. According to case reporting, she seemed fearful about going home. School staff became concerned enough to involve police, and during an interview, Aundria alleged that her adoptive father, Dennis Bowman, was molesting her. This was not a vague atmosphere of unhappiness. It was a specific accusation attached to a specific person inside her home. What happened next would cast a long shadow over everything that followed. A social worker returned Aundria to the family residence and confronted Dennis and Brenda Bowman with the allegation. They denied it. According to the case materials, the Bowmans claimed her behavior reflected rebellion connected to the recent disclosure that she had been adopted. Whatever investigators or child welfare personnel believed at the time, the practical result was clear. Aundria went back to the same environment she had identified as dangerous. Shortly after that intervention, the family relocated to a mobile home in a rural area of Allegan County. Moves happen for many reasons, and by themselves they do not prove anything. But in narrative terms, and eventually in investigative terms, the timing mattered. A teenager who had already raised fear about home life was now living in a more isolated setting, farther from the school environment where adults had noticed something was wrong. If she had tried to create a path out through teachers, staff, or other trusted adults, that path had just narrowed. Then came March 11, 1989. Aundria Bowman disappeared from the family's rural property. She was 14 years old. There was no confirmed scene that clearly pointed to an outside attacker. No public witness account that established where she went. The official starting point of the case came from the people at home, especially from Dennis Bowman, who told police that Aundria had stolen money and run away. That explanation did more than describe a possible event. It framed Aundria's identity inside the case file. Instead of a child whose earlier statements might have pointed to danger at home, she was recorded as an endangered runaway. Even the modified term endangered could not erase the power of the word that followed it. Runaway implies agency. It implies movement by choice. It pushes investigators toward sightings, friends, bus stations, and the possibility of return. It can also pull them away from the last private place the child was known to be. For the human story, this is where the loss becomes harder to measure. Once Aundria was missing, there was no ordinary grief process, no funeral, no certainty, no answer. There was only absence, and an official story suggesting that absence had been chosen. When a child disappears after reporting fear and abuse, every day without clarity deepens the question of whether the system heard the warning but failed to treat it as urgent enough. Once the runaway narrative entered the case, it became a kind of gravity. It shaped how people understood the disappearance and how easily they could imagine an explanation that did not involve homicide. In many cases, a runaway label creates the expectation that the missing teenager will call, reappear, or surface in another town. In Aundria's case, years passed, and that expectation hardened into something close to assumption, even though the timeline that came before her disappearance had already contained an allegation of sexual abuse and fear about returning home. The irony grew sharper as more of Dennis Bowman's background came into view. According to case records, in 1980, he had been arrested after a young woman reported that he attempted to lure her into a wooded area in western Michigan and assault her. He later pleaded guilty to assault through a deal with prosecutors. Years after Aundria vanished, in 1998, he was arrested again for breaking into a coworker's home and stealing items that included women's lingerie. These were not proof of what had happened to Aundria, but they were part of a broader pattern that made the official disappearance story more difficult to accept at face value. And still, the case remained stalled. In 1993, Aundria's photograph appeared in the Soul Asylum music video for Runaway Train, one of the most recognizable cultural artifacts associated with missing child cases in the United States. Millions of viewers saw faces like hers on screen. Some children featured in that video were later found alive. Others were not. Aundria's inclusion was a painful symbol of how a case can become nationally visible without becoming meaningfully resolved. Recognition is not the same thing as answers. In 1999, another cruel turn arrived. A Jane Doe found in a Wisconsin cornfield was at one point believed by some investigators to possibly be Aundria because of similarities in facial structure. For families, and for anyone following a long unsolved disappearance, moments like that create a terrible form of hope. Hope for identification, but also fear that identification will confirm death. DNA later ruled out Aundria, and the remains were eventually identified as Peggy Johnson. The lead closed, but the emotional structure of the case remained the same. Possibility followed by silence. This is where the second storyline, the human consequences, quietly expands. The years did not simply pass, they accumulated. Aundria remained a missing child in databases and public memory. Her case existed in that limbo known to so many cold cases, where enough time has passed for some people to move on, but not enough to erase the unanswered question. There was no confirmed grave, no official correction, and no public reckoning with the fact that she had reportedly tried to signal danger before she vanished. Meanwhile, Dennis Bowman continued living in the world, not as a convicted killer of a child, but as the father of a missing daughter. That is one of the harshest ironies in this case. The story that shielded him did not need to be elaborate. It only needed to be plausible enough, early enough, and repeated long enough. The more time passed, the more the disappearance could be remembered as something mysterious and sad, rather than something that should have triggered immediate suspicion inside the home. Then the case took a turn that did not begin in Michigan at all. In November 2019, the Norfolk Police Homicide Cold Case Section, working with NSYS and other agencies, announced the arrest of Dennis Lee Bowman in Allegan County, Michigan, for the 1980 homicide of 25-year-old Kathleen O'Brien Doyle in Norfolk, Virginia. Doyle had been found murdered in her home on September 11, 1980. Police said the case had been solved through the culmination of long-term effort and forensic evidence. That arrest changed everything around Aundria's disappearance. A man who had helped define one case as a runaway mystery was now under arrest in another state for a decades-old homicide. Once that happened, his life could no longer be divided into neat compartments. Investigators had reason to reassemble the timeline, compare histories, revisit assumptions, and ask whether the most important story in Aundria's case had been the first false one. Sometimes a cold case does not open because of one new witness or one overlooked box of evidence. Sometimes it opens because another crime finally breaks the illusion surrounding the suspect. By early 2020, with Bowman in custody and facing the Virginia case, investigators in Michigan were in a different position than they had been for decades. According to A&E's reporting, Bowman gave several different versions regarding his involvement in Aundria's death. That detail matters because confessions in cold cases are rarely simple or complete. Investigators still have to test what they are told, separate truth from performance, and corroborate every critical fact independently. Then came the breakthrough that changed Aundria from a missing child on paper into a homicide victim with a recovered crime scene. In early February 2020, Bowman confessed to killing her. A few days later, authorities announced that human remains had been found in Allegan County near the Bowman property. Reporting later described the remains as having been concealed beneath a thin layer of cement. After more than 30 years, the ground itself had started to answer what the case file had not. DNA testing confirmed that the remains were Aundria Bowman. That moment restructured the entire history of the case. She had never been lost in some indefinite future return. She had never been a runaway who simply chose not to come home. She had been there all along, in the same county, in the same orbit of the family property, while the wrong explanation carried the public story for decades. Police later said Bowman told them that Aundria suffered a fatal head injury after a violent assault inside the home when she threatened to report that he had molested her. They also said he admitted to dismembering her body and concealing it. However the details were reconstructed, the central truth was now undeniable. The child whose earlier fear had been minimized had not run away at all. The danger had been exactly where she said it was. In May 2020, Dennis Bowman was formally charged with Aundria's murder. By that point, the legal story had become inseparable from the Virginia case that helped force the confession. In June 2020, Bowman pleaded guilty in Norfolk to the rape and murder of Kathleen Doyle and received 2 life sentences, plus an additional 20 years for burglary, with no possibility of parole. The man once associated publicly with a missing child case was now legally established as a killer in another cold case as well. In Michigan, the case moved toward its own conclusion. In December 2021, Bowman pleaded no contest to second-degree murder in Aundria's death. That plea meant he did not formally admit guilt in open narrative terms, but it accepted punishment based on the evidence against him. Then, in February 2022, he was sentenced to an additional 35 to 50 years in prison. According to the Associated Press report carried by CBS, the sentencing judge described him as a serious and dangerous man whose actions had harmed many communities and families. That sentence could never restore the 30 years in which Aundria was missing, mislabeled, and unheard. But it did something essential. It corrected the record. It transferred responsibility away from the child who had been portrayed as rebellious and gone by choice, and placed it where it belonged, on the adult who had controlled the story after she disappeared. In cold cases, justice often arrives late. Sometimes what it can still offer is truth in the official record, and a refusal to let the final version belong to the killer. Aundria Bowman's case is about murder, but it is also about interpretation. It is about what happens when a child says she is afraid, and the system treats that fear as instability instead of evidence. It is about how a single word, runaway, can redirect urgency, shape sympathy, and protect the wrong person for years. And it is about how, Even after decades, facts can still surface. Through a confession, through forensic work, through DNA, and through investigators willing to reopen what others once treated as settled. By the time the case was solved, Aundria was no longer a teenager waiting to be found. She was a victim whose truth had outlived the story told about her. The resolution brought accountability, but it also left a lesson that reaches far beyond one case. When a child signals danger, the cost of misreading that signal may not be measured for years, until the ground finally gives up what the file never did.